Right now, I mean, if you look at the public opinion polling coming out of Cairo in late March 2026, it is just wild. Roughly 95% of the Egyptian public wants to sever all diplomatic ties with Israel immediately.
Oh, it's completely unprecedented.
Yeah, there is a total societal level boycott of Israeli and Western goods going on. I mean, you have college students, labor unions, everyday citizens just marching in the streets, and they are utterly furious at the ongoing war next door.
Right.
They want the Israeli embassy closed, and they want this foundational peace treaty between the two nations torn into a million pieces. But tonight, when those same furious protesters go home, unlock their doors, and flip the light switch in their living rooms, those light bulbs are being powered by Israeli natural gas.
It's the ultimate geopolitical paradox. You have this population demanding a total rupture, but they are living on a power grid that relies on the very state they're protesting against.
How does that even happen? How do two nations end up in a relationship that is so publicly toxic, yet so structurally intertwined that neither can actually, pull the plug? Welcome to The Topic Lens. I am your host, and our mission here is to take the incredibly complex, often chaotic realities of today's geopolitical landscape and provide the underlying context you need to actually understand them.
Yeah, and to be clear, we don't take sides here.
Exactly. We don't push ideological agendas. We just want to make the world a little easier to comprehend.
Because, the headlines you read today are never the beginning of the story. They're usually the third or fourth act of a play that started decades ago.
Right, which brings us to today. Yesterday, we looked at the Eastern Mediterranean from a different angle. We did a deep dive on Greek National Day, March 25th, and we unpacked Greece's incredibly complex, centuries-long historical friction with Turkey.
Right, the Ottoman history and all of that.
Yeah, exactly. But today, we are moving the lens geographically south and east, because today's date, March 26th, 2026, it carries this massive, almost gravitational historical weight. Exactly 47 years ago today, on March 26, 1979, the Egypt-Israel peace treaty was signed on the lawn of the White House,
Finalizing the framework of the Camp David Accords.
Exactly.
And, it was supposed to be the blueprint for a totally new Middle East. You had Anwar Sadat of Egypt, Menachem Begin of Israel, and U.S. President Jimmy Carter. Three men attempting to permanently end 30 years of relentless existential bloodshed between two bitter enemies.
But look at the reality of the Middle East today in 2026. The optimism of that 1979 handshake feels like it belongs in an alternate universe. We're nearly a month into Operation Epic Fury, which began on February 28th.
Right.
And Israel and the United States are currently locked in a direct, escalating, kinetic war with Iran. The Iranian Supreme Leader, Ali Khamenei, has been killed.
Which just set everything off.
Yeah. The Strait of Hormuz, literally the most critical oil choke point on the planet, has been effectively closed by Iranian forces. Global energy markets are in a state of sheer panic.
And caught right in the crossfire of this massive regional inferno is Egypt. The Egyptian state is currently bleeding billions of dollars in revenue.
Because of the Houthis, right.
Exactly. Houthi militants in Yemen, acting in solidarity with Gaza and now Iran, they've reactivated their attacks on commercial shipping in the Red Sea. So they are effectively strangling the Suez Canal, which is it's the economic lifeblood of the Egyptian government.
So here's our mission for this deep dive. We are going to unspool the bizarre, blood-soaked, and fiercely pragmatic legacy of this 47-year-old treaty. How did two nations that fundamentally despised one another forge a cold peace?
A very cold peace.
Oh, yeah. And how did the mechanics of this specific treaty force the United States into becoming the ultimate permanent underwriter of Middle Eastern security? And why, despite the overwhelming public rage in Egypt today, does this fragile, battered piece of paper remain the invisible glue preventing a total regional collapse? Okay, let's unpack this.
Well, to understand why the crisis of 2026 hasn't shattered this treaty, we actually have to go backwards. We have to see the sheer impossibility of the treaty existing in the first place.
Right.
You literally cannot understand the peace without understanding the trauma of the wars that preceded it. The relationship between Egypt and Israel wasn't founded on diplomacy. It was founded on absolute rejection. And it started the exact moment Israel was born.
Okay, let's talk about that inception point. May 14th, 1948, David Ben-Gurion reads the Israeli Declaration of Independence. The British mandate over Palestine is ending. And after decades of Jewish immigration, and obviously in the immediate shadow of the unimaginable horrors of the Holocaust, parts of the international community are ready to recognize a Jewish state. But the surrounding Arab nations view this as a catastrophic colonial imposition.
Completely unacceptable to them.
Right. So it seems like the relationship between Israel and Egypt wasn't just cold from day one, it was instantly violent. Walk me through that initial collision.
Oh, it was immediate. Literally the very next day, May 15th, 1948, a coalition of Arab armies invaded the newly declared state.
The very next day.
The next day. And this included forces from Egypt, Transjordan, Syria, Lebanon, and Iraq. Now, the strategic goal of the Arab nations, led in large part by the Egyptian military, was to basically strangle the state of Israel in its crib.
Wow.
They possessed conventional armies, established supply lines, armor. Israel, by contrast, was a brand new state in total chaos. They were relying on hastily organized militias and smuggled weapons.
But, surprisingly, the Arab coalition loses. Israel survives and actually expands its territorial control beyond the original UN partition plan borders.
Yes, and the psychological impact of that 1948 defeat on the Arab world, particularly on Egypt, which really saw itself as the cultural and military leader of the Arab sphere, it's hard to overstate.
It must have been crushing.
It was a profound humiliation. You had a massive, well-funded Egyptian army defeated by a patchwork militia of refugees and settlers. That trauma birthed a deep revanchist desire within the Egyptian military to wash away the shame of 1948.
Which naturally brings us to the rise of Gamal Abdel Nasser in Egypt. He's this charismatic, fiercely nationalist military officer who eventually takes power, and in 1956, he triggers the Suez Crisis.
All right.
The mechanics of this are fascinating to me because it's a military defeat that he somehow spins into a colossal political victory. How does he actually pull that off?
Well, Nasser decides to nationalize the Suez Canal, basically ripping control of this vital global waterway away from the British and the French.
Which is a huge deal.
Massive. It's a massive assertion of Arab sovereignty.
Yeah.
So in response, Britain and France secretly conspire with Israel. The plan is for Israel to invade the Sinai Peninsula and push toward the canal.
Okay.
And that would give the British and French a pretext to intervene militarily, supposedly to protect the waterway, but really to topple Nasser.
And militarily, the Israeli part of the plan works flawlessly, right? I mean, they sweep through the Sinai in a matter of days.
They do. Militarily, the Egyptian forces are completely routed, but geopolitically, the British, French, and Israelis totally miscalculated the reaction of the two global superpowers.
The U.S. and the Soviets.
Right. The United States, led by President Dwight D. Eisenhower, is absolutely furious. Eisenhower is trying to court the Arab world away from the Soviet Union, and this colonial-style invasion is just a disaster for U.S. foreign policy.
And it makes the West look terrible.
Exactly. So the U.S. and the Soviets both apply crushing economic and diplomatic pressure. Eisenhower essentially threatens to ruin the British currency if they don't withdraw.
Wow. So the invading forces are forced to just pack up and go home, completely undercutting their own military victory.
Exactly. And because Nasser survived the combined assault of two European empires and Israel, he emerges not as a defeated general, but as an absolute titan. I mean, he becomes the undisputed hero of pan-Arab nationalism. He stood up to the colonial powers, and he won.
But Israel is still there, right, completely surrounded by hostile states living in a permanent state of high alert. The borders are incredibly tense, and this tension just builds and builds until it finally snaps in 1967, the Six-Day War.
Right.
Now, I know 1967 is often pointed to as the defining trauma for the modern Arab world, but let's break down the mechanics of how it actually happened, because Israel didn't wait to be attacked this time, did they?
No, they didn't. By May of 1967, Nasser had expelled UN peacekeepers from the Sinai border. He massed tens of thousands of Egyptian troops near Israel, and he blockaded the Straits of Tiran, which cut off Israel's southern port of Eilat.
So he's choking them economically.
Yes. And Israel viewed this as a clear casus belli act of war. Fearing a multi-front invasion that could quite literally wipe them out, the Israeli leadership authorized a preemptive strike.
Operation Focus.
Operation Focus. On the morning of June 10, 1967, nearly the entire Israeli Air Force took off. They flew out over the Mediterranean, flying incredibly low, sometimes literally just feet above the water.
Just to evade the Egyptian radar.
Exactly. And they maintained complete radio silence. They arrived over Egyptian air bases just as the morning patrols were landing and the pilots were heading to breakfast.
Oh.
In a matter of hours, Israel destroyed over 300 Egyptian combat aircraft while they were still parked on the tarmac.
So before the Egyptian army even knows the war has started, they have completely lost the sky. They have zero air cover.
Nothing. And without air cover, the Egyptian army in the Sinai was sitting ducks. The Israeli armored columns just tore through the peninsula. The retreat orders given to the Egyptian military were totally chaotic.
I read it was a complete disaster.
Oh, thousands of Egyptian soldiers simply abandoned their vehicles and tried to walk back across the scorching 60,000 square kilometers of the Sinai Desert. Hundreds, possibly thousands, died of thirst and exposure alone.
That is horrific.
It was. And in exactly 6 days, Israel captured the Gaza Strip and the entire Sinai Peninsula from Egypt, the West Bank and East Jerusalem from Jordan, and the Golan Heights from Syria.
So the entire map of the Middle East is rewritten in under a week. We talked about 1948 being a humiliation, but 1967 sounds like a complete psychological shattering for Egypt.
It was a devastation that reached the very core of the Arab identity. The Pan-Arab Project, which Nasser championed, was exposed as totally hollow. The loss of the Sinai, which is sovereign Egyptian territory, was a wound that just refused to heal.
And the Arab League's response was pretty absolute, right?
Very. They met shortly after in Khartoum and issued their famous 3 no's. No peace with Israel, no recognition of Israel, no negotiations with it. The trauma was so deep that absolute rejection was the only politically survivable stance for any Arab leader at that time.
Which sets the stage perfectly for Anwar Sadat. Nasser dies of a heart attack in 1970 and Sadat takes over. And his country's economy is just bleeding to death because they are on a permanent war footing, trying to rebuild the military to take back the Sinai.
Right.
So in 1973, Sadat does something incredibly audacious, the Yom Kippur War. He launches a massive surprise attack. But looking at the historical analysis, Sadat's strategy here is actually really counterintuitive. He didn't launch this war thinking he was going to march all the way to Tel Aviv, did he?
Not at all. What's fascinating here is that Sadat was far too pragmatic for that. He knew he could not completely destroy the state of Israel, especially knowing they were backed by the United States.
Right.
The 1973 war was primarily a political tool, masked as a military operation.
I want to make sure I understand the mechanism here. Why launch a brutal, high-casualty surprise attack against a superior military if your ultimate goal isn't total victory?
Because you cannot negotiate from a position of total subjugation.
Oh, interesting.
Sadat knew Egypt's economy was failing. He knew he eventually needed American investment, and he needed to pivot away from the Soviet Union. But if he went to Israel and asked for the Sinai back after the total humiliation of 1967, he would look like a beggar.
They just laugh him out of the room.
Exactly. The Israelis would have zero incentive to give him anything. He needed to change the psychological equation.
So it's almost like getting into a brutal bar fight, taking a few heavy hits, but landing a solid, undeniable punch to the jaw, just so you earn enough respect to sit down and buy the guy a drink afterward.
Has the perfect analogy. On October 6, 1973, Yom Kippur, the holiest day in the Jewish calendar, when Israel was virtually shut down, the Egyptian military achieved complete tactical surprise.
And they used water cannons, right? That always blows my mind.
Yeah, it was brilliant engineering. They used high-pressure water cannons to literally wash away the massive sand embankments of Israel's Bar-Lev defensive line on the Suez Canal. The Egyptian army crossed the canal and established a real foothold in the Sinai.
They proved they could fight. They proved they weren't the broken, retreating army of 1967.
Yes. Now, militarily, the Israelis eventually recovered from the initial shock. They mobilized their reserves, counterattacked, and actually crossed the canal into Egypt proper, surrounding the Egyptian Third Army.
So Israel ends up on top again, militarily.
They do. By the time a ceasefire was imposed, Israel was in a dominant military position. But for Sadat, that didn't matter. He had secured his strategic objective.
He crossed the canal.
He crossed the canal. He inflicted heavy casualties on the supposedly invincible Israeli military. He restored Egyptian pride. He washed away the shame of 1967, which gave him the domestic credibility to eventually seek peace. He proved Egypt had guts.
He literally fought his way to the negotiating table. But what Anwar Sadat did next shocked the Arab world even more than a surprise military attack. He initiated what we can only call the theater of peace.
A very dramatic theater.
Yeah. Let's look at the personalities involved here, because they are wildly divergent. On one side, you have Anwar Sadat. He's highly theatrical, emotional, a visionary who looks at the grand sweep of history and isn't afraid of these massive, grand gestures.
And across the table, you have the newly elected Israeli Prime Minister Menachem Begin. And Begin is Sadat's polar opposite.
In every way.
In every way.
Yeah.
Where Sadat is broad strokes, Begin is obsessed with legalistic details. He's a lawyer by training. More importantly, Begin is a survivor of the Holocaust. He lost his parents and his brother to the Nazis.
Wow.
And before 1948, he led the Irgun, which was a militant underground paramilitary group that fought the British authorities in Palestine. So he is a fierce, uncompromising, deeply ideological nationalist who firmly believes in the historical and biblical borders of the land of Israel.
You literally could not script two men with more opposing worldviews. So picture this scene. It is November 9, 1977. Sadat is giving a speech to the Egyptian parliament in Cairo. And sitting right there in the audience is Yasser Arafat, the leader of the Palestine Liberation Organization, the PLO.
Right. And the PLO's entire reason for existing is the armed struggle against Israel. And Sadat goes completely off script.
It is one of the most stunning moments in 20th century diplomacy. Sadat looks out from the podium and declares that he is willing to go to the ends of the earth to prevent another Egyptian soldier from being wounded or killed.
And then he drops the bombshell.
He does. He says he is even willing to go to the Israeli Knesset, their parliament in Jerusalem, to talk to them directly.
And Arafat is sitting right there.
Yes. And at first, the audience laughs a bit. They assume it's just a rhetorical flourish, a politician exaggerating. But Arafat sits there completely stunned, realizing what Sadat is actually saying.
Because just saying the word Knesset implies recognition.
Exactly. The Arab world's stance since 1967 was the three no's. No recognition, no negotiation. By offering to visit the capital of the enemy, Sadat was shattering a decade of absolute taboo.
I imagine the blowback was instant.
The Arab world was furious. Sadat's own foreign minister resigned in protest almost immediately. But he isn't bluffing. 10 days later, Anwar Sadat boards an airplane and flies to Tel Aviv. The historical accounts of this moment are just incredible. The Israeli cabinet was practically paralyzed by paranoia.
Well, you have to view it through their eyes. This is a man who launched a devastating surprise attack on their holiest day just 4 years prior.
Right. They don't trust him at all.
Not even a little.
Yeah.
The Israeli military went on high alert. The chief of staff genuinely feared it was an elaborate Trojan horse, that the plane would land, the doors would open, and Egyptian commandos would pour out and assassinate the entire Israeli leadership waiting on the tarmac.
That's how tense it was.
There were snipers positioned on the roofs of the airport buildings.
The tension must have been suffocating. The plane lands, the door opens, and Anwar Sadat steps out in a dark suit, smoking a pipe and smiling.
Just a masterclass in imagery.
Yeah. He shakes hands with Golda Meir, his adversary from the 1973 war. He visits the Al-Aqsa Mosque in Jerusalem, and crucially, he visits Yad Vashem, Israel's Holocaust Memorial, and lays a wreath.
Which is huge.
Yeah.
He recognizes their trauma.
And then he speaks to the Knesset. Now, he doesn't surrender. He forcefully demands the return of all occupied Arab territories and the recognition of Palestinian rights. But he sandwiches those demands with the magic words that changed everything. He tells the Israeli parliament, "We welcome you among us with full security and safety."
By simply standing at that podium, he grants them the one thing they have craved since 1948. Legitimacy. He shatters the psychological wall.
But as profound as that icebreaker was, getting an actual legally binding treaty signed proved to be agonizing. Fast forward to September 1978. The peace process is dying. Sadat and Begin's personalities are clashing disastrously.
They really hated each other's working style.
Right. Begin wants to debate the legal interpretation of every single comma, and Sadat is losing his mind over the minutiae, focusing only on the return of the Sinai. The talks are stalled.
Which forces the entry of the third crucial player, U.S. President Jimmy Carter. Carter was a deeply moral, intensely detail-oriented former peanut farmer from Georgia.
And he viewed this as a very personal mission, didn't he?
He did. He viewed peace in the Middle East not just as a geopolitical imperative, but almost as a divine mission. He sees the talks collapsing, so he makes a radical, totally unprecedented move. He invites Sadat and Begin, along with their delegations, to Camp David.
Camp David, the secluded presidential retreat hidden in the wooded mountains of Maryland, far away from Washington.
The geography of Camp David was Carter's masterstroke. The environment he created there was a psychological pressure cooker. I mean, the cabins are rustic, the pathways are wooded, people are riding bicycles.
It's basically a summer camp.
Right. But the most important feature of Camp David for those 13 days in September was what Carter explicitly banned: the press.
No cameras, no microphones, no daily briefings.
That was the key.
Okay.
Carter knew that if Sadat and Begin were in Washington holding daily press conferences, they would immediately start posturing.
Playing to the base.
Exactly. They would speak to the cameras, playing to their domestic audiences back in Cairo and Jerusalem. Neither man could afford to look weak or compromising on television. But trapped in the woods, stripped of their formal suits, eating meals together, They couldn't play to the gallery.
They had no audience but each other.
Right. They had to actually negotiate.
But even with the isolation, it almost fell apart completely. The tension was still there. I read that on day 3, Sadat actually snaps. He's had enough of Begin's stubborn refusal to commit to removing Israeli settlements from the Sinai.
He was done.
Sadat packs his bags, orders his delegation to pack up, and calls for a helicopter to take him back to Washington. He's leaving.
It was the absolute crisis point.
Yeah.
And Carter literally had to physically block the door of Sadat's cabin.
Wow. The President of the United States blocking a door.
Yes. And Carter dropped all diplomatic niceties. He told Sadat, point blank, that if he walked out, he wasn't just ending the peace process. He would personally destroy the relationship between the United States and Egypt, and he would ruin Carter's presidency in the process.
So he brings down the hammer.
He used the full crushing weight of American geopolitical leverage to force Sadat to unpack his bags.
He essentially bullied him into staying. And the breakthrough with Begin is even more cinematic, and it hinges on something so deeply human. Begin is absolutely refusing to agree to dismantle the Israeli settlements that had been built in the Sinai.
It was a red line for him.
He will not sign any document that requires him to uproot Jewish communities. The whole 13-day summit is about to end in failure over this one specific issue. And Carter brings over a stack of photographs.
This is one of the most remarkable moments in diplomatic history. Carter had acquired photographs of his own grandchildren, and he had taken the time to personalize them, writing specific inscriptions using the names of Menachem Begin's grandchildren.
That is so calculated, but so brilliant.
Oh, it was brilliant. When Carter handed the stack of photos over, began reading the names of his own grandchildren out loud, and the emotional dam just broke. Begin, this hardened, uncompromising former paramilitary fighter who had survived the worst horrors of the 20th century, broke down in tears.
Wow.
In that moment, Carter bypassed the legalistic armor. He forced a map. Begin to see that they weren't negotiating legal precedents or lines on a map. They were negotiating the reality of the world their grandchildren would have to inhabit.
That is staggering. The fate of millions of people, the geopolitical architecture of the entire Middle East, resting on a brief moment of shared grandfatherhood. So that emotional breakthrough allows them to compromise. They agree on a framework. What exactly did they agree to? What was the actual substance of the document signed on that White House lawn on March 26, 1979?
The treaty established several foundational pillars. First, mutual recognition. Egypt recognized Israel as a legitimate sovereign state, the first Arab country to ever cross that line.
Which we know is a massive taboo.
Huge. Second, it declared an official end to the state of war that had existed between them for 30 years. Third, Israel agreed to a full-phased military and civilian withdrawal from the entire Sinai Peninsula, returning sovereign control to Egypt.
So they gave up the land.
To give it the land. Fourth, Egypt guaranteed free passage for Israeli ships through the Suez Canal and the Straits of Tiran. And finally, the United States promised massive ongoing military and economic aid to both nations to essentially underwrite the financial risk they were taking by making peace.
Okay, so they signed the paper, they shook hands, they promised no more bloodshed. But looking at the historical record, the ink was barely dry before the blood started spilling again. The backlash to this treaty was immediate, and it was brutal.
Oh, for Egypt, the diplomatic isolation was instantaneous and totally devastating. They were accused of ultimate treason by the rest of the Arab world.
Because they left the Palestinians behind.
That was the perception. The perception was that Sadat had abandoned the Palestinian cause and broken Arab unity purely to get his own patch of sand back. Egypt was immediately suspended from the Arab League, and the League's headquarters were physically moved out of Cairo to Tunis.
Just to punish them.
Yes. Syria cut diplomatic ties with Egypt, a freeze that lasted for 26 years. Egypt became a pariah in its own neighborhood.
And the personal price for the leaders who signed it was even worse. Let's look at the tragic endings here. October 6, 1981. It is exactly the 8th anniversary of Sadat's Yom Kippur War victory.
Right.
He is sitting in the reviewing stand at a massive military parade in Cairo celebrating the crossing of the canal, and a squad of soldiers jumps out of a passing artillery truck. They are militants belonging to the Egyptian Islamic Jihad, his own countrymen, members of his own military, who viewed him as a traitor to Islam and the Arab world for making peace with Israel.
It was a horrific scene.
They open fire on the reviewing stand with assault rifles and throw grenades. Sadat is assassinated. He is murdered for the peace he created.
And Menachem Begin's fate, while entirely different in its mechanics, was also steeped in tragedy.
He lived, but
He won the Nobel Peace Prize alongside Sadat. But in 1982, his government launched a massive, disastrous invasion of Lebanon to root out the PLO. The war became a complete quagmire, but the breaking point for Begin was the Sabra and Shatila massacres.
we need to define that for the listener because it's crucial to understanding Begin's downfall. What exactly happened at Sabra and Shatila?
Sabra and Shatila were Palestinian refugee camps in Beirut. Following the assassination of the Lebanese president, who was an Israeli ally, Christian Phalangist militias entered these camps and massacred hundreds, possibly thousands, of Palestinian civilians over a period of 2 days.
And what was Israel's role in that?
Well, crucially, the Israeli military had surrounded the camps, controlled access to them, and even fired flares into the night sky to illuminate the area, allowing the militias to carry out the killings.
Oh, wow.
The global outrage was massive, and an Israeli commission later found the government, including the defense minister Ariel Sharon, indirectly responsible for failing to stop the bloodshed.
And the moral weight of that crushes Begin?
It did. Haunted by the mounting Israeli casualties in Lebanon, the death of his wife, and the horrific stain of the massacres, Begin's mental health just collapsed. He resigned from office, retreated into deep isolation in his Jerusalem apartment, and lived the rest of his life largely out of the public eye.
Even Jimmy Carter paid a price. I mean, the Camp David Accords were his crowning foreign policy achievement. But he lost the 1980 presidential election to Ronald Reagan in a landslide.
It didn't save him.
No. The triumph of Camp David was completely overshadowed by a stagnant domestic economy and the humiliation of the 1979 Iran hostage crisis. Plus, the Camp David framework completely failed to deliver on its vague, heavily conditioned promises for Palestinian autonomy, leaving a festering wound that continues to dictate regional violence to this day.
This raises an important question, and it brings up the core analytical concept of the Egypt-Israel Treaty. Political scientists universally refer to it as a cold peace.
A cold peace.
And that duality is vital. On a macro, state-to-state level, the treaty was an undeniable, spectacular success. It prevented another conventional tank-on-tank war that could have bankrupted Egypt or potentially wiped out Israel. It worked.
But on the street?
On a micro-societal level, it failed entirely to win the hearts and minds of the Egyptian populace. Sadat traded ideological purity and pan-Arab unity for his nation's physical and economic survival, and he paid the ultimate price.
Here's where it gets really interesting to me. We romanticize peacemaking. We give out Nobel Prizes for it, but historically, peacemaking is incredibly dangerous work.
Extremely dangerous.
It requires a leader to actively betray their own political base, to give up the core unifying grievances that bind their people together. But looking at the years that followed, I have to ask, did this treaty actually bring peace to the Middle East, or did it just change who was fighting?
Well, it unquestionably shifted the tectonic plates of regional conflict. By removing the largest, best-equipped Arab Army Egypt's military from the battlefield, it guaranteed Israel's survival against a conventional multi-front invasion.
So the existential threat of conventional war is gone.
Exactly. But as you suggest, the mechanics of the conflict merely evolved. Because Israel no longer had to worry about a massive armored thrust from the south, it arguably freed up Israeli military capacity to focus on non-state actors and insurgencies.
Oh, I see.
It allowed for the 1982 invasion of Lebanon to target the PLO. It shifted the paradigm from conventional wars between sovereign states to asymmetrical, grinding wars against militias like Hezbollah and later Hamas. The peace treaty didn't end violence. It fundamentally changed its nature.
And that structural shift leads us perfectly to the country that underwrote the whole deal. Because the 1979 treaty didn't just change the borders of Egypt and Israel, it permanently chained the United States to the Middle East. Let's talk about the Accidental Empire.
We really need to shatter a very common historical misconception here. There is this pervasive assumption today that the United States has always offered boundless, unconditional military and diplomatic support to Israel from the exact moment of its creation.
Right, like it was always a given.
And looking at the historical record, that simply isn't true.
No, the early documents show a lot of friction. President Harry Truman initially hesitated to recognize Israel in 1948 because his defense and State Departments were absolutely terrified of alienating Arab oil-producing nations.
They needed the oil.
They needed that oil for the post-war recovery of Europe. And we already discussed 1956 during the Suez Crisis. President Eisenhower actively forced Israel, Britain, and France to back down under threat of severe economic sanctions. That is the opposite of a blank check.
The paradigm shift really began in 1967. After Israel's overwhelming, decisive victory in the Six-Day War, the U.S. military and intelligence establishments stopped viewing Israel as a vulnerable liability.
They saw them as a winner?
Exactly. They started viewing them as a highly capable, battle-tested strategic asset in the Cold War against Soviet-backed Arab states like Egypt and Syria. And this relationship was cemented in blood and steel during the 1973 Yom Kippur War.
Operation Nickel Grass?
Yes. When Israel was reeling from the initial Egyptian and Syrian surprise attacks and running dangerously low on munitions, President Richard Nixon ordered a massive emergency airlift of weapons and supplies to save Israel from defeat.
That's a huge commitment.
That was the moment the U.S. explicitly tied its own strategic credibility to Israel's survival.
But 1979 is the ultimate geopolitical masterstroke for American grand strategy. By mediating this treaty, Jimmy Carter achieves something incredible for the U.S. position in the Cold War. He uses the peace process to physically kick the Soviet Union out of the Middle East's most populous and important country.
Which is Egypt.
Right. Egypt had somewhere between 15,000 to 20,000 Soviet military advisors. Sadat expelled them to pivot to Washington. The U.S. secured the Suez Canal for Western commercial shipping and locked the Soviets out. But they had to buy this peace, literally.
This is the concept of the peace check. In exchange for signing the treaty and taking on the massive domestic and regional risks, the United States agreed to provide annual, guaranteed military and economic aid to both nations.
And it's a lot of money.
Fast forward to recent years, and that financial architecture looks like roughly $3.8 billion annually to Israel and about $1.3 billion annually to Egypt.
So, if we strip away the diplomatic language, the U.S. is essentially paying the mortgage on regional stability.
If we connect this to the bigger picture, that is precisely how it functions mechanically. The 1979 treaty institutionalized U.S. involvement. Prior to Camp David, the U.S. was an outside observer, an occasional mediator, or an arms supplier.
But after?
After Camp David, the U.S. became the structural, load-bearing pillar of the region. Those billions in aid are the financial glue holding the demilitarized zones together. If Washington pulls the funding, the leverage evaporates, and the treaty risks collapsing. The United States bought a peace that it now has to maintain forever.
And the synchronicity of the timeline is just wild to me. Right as Carter is finalizing this treaty in early 1979, the Iranian Revolution is peaking. The U.S.-backed Shah of Iran falls. Ayatollah Khomeini returns from exile and takes over.
The timing is profound. In 1979, the United States lost Iran, which had been its primary strategic and intelligence pillar in the Persian Gulf. But almost simultaneously, the U.S. gained Egypt as an allied anchor in the Arab world.
Like a one-for-one trade.
The U.S. essentially swapped one regional pillar for another, and that exact geopolitical chessboard, an American-backed alliance of Israel and Egypt aligned against a revolutionary anti-Western Iran, is the exact chessboard we are looking at today in 2026.
It is an incredible historical irony. Jimmy Carter's deeply moral, peaceful ambition ended up turning Israel into essentially a heavily armed extension of the U.S. security apparatus and turned Egypt into a financially dependent client state. He locked the U.S. into the Middle East indefinitely. And that 47-year-old American chessboard. Right now, in late March 2026, it is completely on fire.
Let's bring the listener fully into the present moment. Fast forward from the sunny White House lawn in 1979 to the grim realities of today. It has been nearly a month since the U.S. and Israel launched Operation Epic Fury on February 28, 2026.
The situation reports outline a terrifying escalation. The United States and Israel are no longer fighting proxy wars. They are in a direct, kinetic conflict with Iran.
Direct combat.
Iran's supreme leader, Ali Khamenei, was killed in the initial strikes. In retaliation, Iranian forces have effectively closed the Strait of Hormuz. Roughly 20% of the world's oil flows through that narrow waterway, so shutting it down sends a shockwave through the global economy.
Oh, massive shockwaves.
And down in Yemen, the Houthis, acting in explicit solidarity with Iran and Gaza, have fully reactivated their drone and missile attacks on commercial shipping in the Red Sea.
Which brings us to the devastating economic impact on Egypt. We need to explain the mechanics of the Suez Canal because it isn't just a waterway. It is effectively a massive toll booth that pays the mortgage for the entire Egyptian state. Because of the persistent Houthi attacks in the Red Sea, the major global shipping companies, Maersk, Hapag-Lloyd, MSC, have deemed the route too dangerous. They have diverted their massive cargo vessels around the Cape of Good Hope at the southern tip of Africa.
That diversion adds weeks to the journey and millions of dollars in fuel costs for the shipping companies. But for Egypt, it's an existential crisis. The data out of Cairo is disastrous.
It really is.
In 2023, toll revenues from the Suez Canal brought in a record $10.3 billion for the Egyptian government. Today, due to the diversions, those revenues have plummeted to around $4 billion. Egypt is losing roughly $800 million in hard currency every single month.
And this is happening to a country already staggering under massive external debt, crippling inflation, and severe currency devaluation. The loss of that Suez revenue means the government struggles to subsidize basic necessities, like imported wheat for bread.
And hungry people get angry quickly.
Exactly. The economic desperation is acting as an accelerant for the incredible political anger on the street.
The Egyptian street is boiling over. As we mentioned at the start, 95% of Egyptians want all ties with Israel severed immediately. There is a total grassroots boycott of any Western brand perceived to be sympathetic to Israel. Fast food chains, coffee shops, sodas, they are empty.
Completely deserted.
The public views Israel purely as an aggressive occupying force conducting a brutal war against Palestinians, and they view the 1979 treaty as a straitjacket that prevents Egypt from intervening to stop the suffering.
And it is crucial to look at this neutrally, recognizing the absolute existential imperatives of everyone involved here. President Abdel Fattah el-Sisi of Egypt is walking a terrifying tightrope. He is practicing what geopolitical analysts call isolated pragmatism.
Isolated pragmatism.
Right. On one hand, he faces an Israeli government fighting what it views as a literal fight for national survival, a multi-front war against Iran, Hezbollah, and Hamas. Israel is prioritizing its security above all other diplomatic concerns following the trauma of its own recent history.
But on the other hand, Sisi faces his own starving, furious populace. He has to maintain back-channel communications with Israeli leadership to coordinate border security. He desperately needs to prevent a scenario where a massive influx of refugees from Gaza pours over the border into the Sinai Peninsula.
Because that would be catastrophic for him.
Right. The Egyptian government views that displacement as a red line, a threat to Egyptian sovereignty, and a potential destabilization of the Sinai itself.
Exactly. Sisi cannot allow the border to collapse, but even speaking to Israeli officials to manage that border infuriates his public.
So if I'm looking at this logically, if the Egyptian economy is crashing due to the regional war, and 95% of the public demands that the treaty be torn up, why hasn't el-Sisi just walked away from Camp David? Why not rip up the paper and gain the support of the street?
Because the 1979 treaty isn't just about managing the border with Israel anymore. It's about who holds the geopolitical purse strings. To answer why Egypt doesn't walk away, we have to look at the mechanics of who is actually funding the Egyptian state today in 2026. Because the unipolar world of the 1990s is gone. It's not just the Americans writing the checks anymore.
The power dynamics have radically shifted. The economic data indicates that Egypt is surviving right now through massive, unprecedented Gulf bailouts.
Truly unprecedented.
We are talking about a staggering $35 billion investment from the United Arab Emirates to develop the Ras Al Hekma coastal project. That's cash injected directly into the Egyptian central bank to stabilize the currency. Plus, there's nearly $30 billion in ongoing investments from Qatar.
That influx of Gulf capital fundamentally alters the leverage in the region. For decades, the U.S. State Department knew that the annual $1.3 billion in American military aid was the leash that kept Egypt compliant with the Camp David framework.
But $1.3 billion looks tiny next to $65 billion.
Exactly. When you have $65 billion flowing in from Abu Dhabi and Doha, that American leash suddenly has a lot more slack. The U.S. cannot dictate terms to Cairo the way it could in 1995.
And it's not just economic diversification, it's military alliances too. In February 2026, just last month, Egypt signed a massive strategic defense pact with Turkey.
The drone deal.
Yeah. The agreement includes the co-production of advanced combat drones and the deployment of the Turkish-made Tolga air defense systems on Egyptian soil. They are actively, aggressively shifting their military reliance away from Washington.
This is the defining feature of the 2026 crisis. The Middle East of 1979, when Camp David was signed, was bipolar. You were either anchored to the United States or the Soviet Union. The Middle East of 2026 is highly multipolar.
Everyone's making their own deals.
Right. Middle powers like Turkey, the UAE, and Saudi Arabia are pursuing their own aggressive foreign policies independent of Washington. Egypt is utilizing this new multipolarity to leverage the 1979 treaty not as a peace agreement, but as a geopolitical weapon.
Wait, how so? By threatening to break it?
Yes. Because they are less desperate for American cash, Cairo feels emboldened to actively threaten the U.S. and Israel. The Egyptian Foreign Ministry has stated clearly in back channels and in public leaks that if Israel pushes its military operations permanently into the Philadelphia corridor, which is that narrow border zone between Gaza and Egypt, or if Israeli actions displace Palestinians into the Sinai, Egypt will officially suspend the 1979 treaty.
Let me make sure I follow the mechanics of this leverage. So Egypt is essentially taking the treaty hostage to force the United States to rein in Israel's military operations.
That is the exact play. Egypt is acting as the geopolitical gatekeeper. They're sending a message to Washington. Control Israel's actions on our border, or we will pivot fully to our new defense partners in Turkey and our financial backers in the Gulf, and your beautiful 47-year-old Camp David peace architecture dies today.
Wow.
And to prove they are serious, Egyptian intelligence occasionally throttles critical information sharing regarding border smuggling, giving Israel a small, painful taste of what a broken treaty would actually look like.
But beneath the fiery public threats, the street boycotts, and the shifting multipolar alliances, there is a hidden, highly pragmatic, almost cynical layer of state survival keeping this treaty alive. Let's talk about the invisible glue holding 2026 together. And this brings us back to the paradox we opened the show with, the electricity.
Yes, the political rhetoric is white hot, but the reality is dictated by cold, hard economics and security integration. Take the energy paradox. Despite the political deep freeze, the Egyptian state is structurally dependent on a massive $35 billion deal for Israeli natural gas.
How does that actually work?
The mechanics are deeply intertwined. Israel extracts the gas from its offshore fields in the Mediterranean. It pipes that gas to Egypt. Egypt processes and liquefies some of it for export, but crucially, it uses a massive portion of that Israeli gas to keep its own domestic power grid running.
So if Sisi actually bows to the demands of the street and tears up the treaty, Israel shuts off the pipeline valve, Cairo goes dark, the rolling blackouts return, and the very people demanding the end of the treaty would be rioting in the dark over the lack of electricity.
Exactly. It would cause immediate domestic collapse. Furthermore, look at the manufacturing sector, specifically the QIZ agreements, the qualified industrial zones.
I've heard of these, but what are they?
This is a brilliant, almost coercive piece of economic diplomacy. Egyptian textile manufacturers are granted highly coveted, tariff-free access to the massive United States consumer market. But there is a catch.
There's always a catch.
To qualify for that tariff-free status, the Egyptian-made product, say a t-shirt or a pair of jeans, must contain a specific mandated percentage of Israeli-made components or inputs.
So they forced supply chain integration through diplomacy. You literally can't sell your shirt in New York unless you bought the thread from Tel Aviv.
You've got it. They're economically chained together by the ankle.
That is wild.
It forces business owners in both countries to cooperate, regardless of the political climate. And this invisible glue extends heavily into the military realm, too. We mentioned earlier that the 1979 treaty strictly demilitarized the Sinai Peninsula, creating a massive buffer zone. But the reality on the ground in the last decade has required bending those rules to the breaking point.
Because of the insurgency?
Yes. When ISIS-affiliated militant groups became a massive, lethal threat in the northern Sinai over the last decade, the Egyptian military needed to go in and crush them. But the treaty explicitly forbade Egypt from deploying heavy armor or attack helicopters in that zone.
So what did they do?
Well, behind the scenes, the Egyptian military and the Israeli Defense Forces, the IDF, communicated constantly. Israel actively approved Egypt, bringing in heavy weapons, Apache helicopters, and massive troop deployments into the Sinai to fight the militants.
Wait, really? Israel allowed the Egyptian military to heavily arm the border zone that the treaty explicitly said must remain empty.
They did, because an ISIS stronghold on the border was a mutual threat. They share intelligence daily. And the Multinational Force and Observers, the MFO, the independent peacekeeping force set up in the Sinai because the UN wouldn't do it, they quietly monitor all of this, essentially looking the other way as the strict rules of the treaty are bent for mutual survival.
So when we put all these pieces together, what does this actually mean? The cold peace works exactly because it's cold. It's not built on cultural exchange or student study abroad programs or warm, fuzzy feelings between citizens. It is built on mutually assured economic and security destruction. It's a pragmatic transaction between generals and technocrats.
It is the ultimate marriage of convenience. If Egypt breaks the treaty, their power grid fails, their textile economy collapses, they lose their leverage with Washington, and they invite a massive security crisis on their border.
And for Israel?
If Israel loses the treaty, they lose their quiet southern border and face a catastrophic multi-front war, simultaneously fighting Iran in the east, Hezbollah in the north, and a newly hostile, heavily armed Egypt in the south. They are handcuffed to one another.
It is a phenomenal, deeply cynical, but ultimately successful story of state survival. Let's recap this incredible journey. We started with the psychological devastation of the wars of 1948 and 1967. We saw Anwar Sadat's brilliant, violent gamble in 1973 to earn the right to negotiate.
Earning the respect to buy the drink, as you said.
Exactly. We followed him as he stepped off a plane in Jerusalem in 1977, risking everything to shatter a 30-year taboo. We went to the isolated, press-free woods of Camp David, where Jimmy Carter used the emotional weight of grandchildren to melt Menachem Begin's legalistic armor.
The turning point.
We saw the heavy, bloody price of this peace, the assassinations, the moral collapse, the billions of American dollars spent to buy stability and lock the U.S. into an accidental empire.
And we brought it all the way to the inferno of today, March 2026, a region where the U.S., Israel, Iran, and Egypt are locked in a high-stakes, multipolar standoff. The 1979 treaty is bruised, it is battered, and it is actively, fiercely despised by millions of people on the street.
But it remains the only structural flaw preventing a total freefall in the Middle East. It is a vital reminder for you, the listener. The next time you read a dramatic headline about the Middle East or see footage of massive protests commanding geopolitical rupture, remember that beneath the ideological rhetoric and the genuine public anger, geography and economics are the real, unforgiving dictators of foreign policy.
States will ultimately act in their own survival interest, even when it requires maintaining deeply uncomfortable, highly unpopular partnerships.
Which leaves me with one final provocative thought. For 47 years, the world has relied on the courage of leaders who were willing to be hated by their own people in exchange for a pragmatic peace.
It takes immense bravery.
It does. Anwar Sadat and Menachem Begin made agonizing compromises in the total isolated secrecy of Camp David. But looking at the intense polarization of the world today in 2026, if Camp David had to happen today, in the era of TikTok, endless social media echo chambers, and instant viral public outrage, could a leader like Sadat or Begin even survive 13 days in the woods without being completely toppled by a trending hashtag back home before the ink was even dry?
It really makes you wonder if the diplomatic isolation required for true compromise is even physically possible in the modern age.
The paper signed in 1979 might be battered, but it's surviving the hurricane. Let's just hope it continues to hold. Thank you for joining us on this deep dive into the history that is shaping our present. We will see you next time.